the training he
Yes,
went through
yes,
before he became.
They were.
And people don't know that, and that speaks directly to what you're saying, that the ancient European traditions, especially in Ireland, I mean, Ireland had an incredible mystery school, and that Jesus studied in. People don't realize that.
Yeah, it does, and what's particularly encouraging and heartening is to realize that 2,000 years ago, and indeed 4,000 and 6,000 years ago, these schools of sacred knowledge, which you could really think of as metaphysical schools in theory and practice, looking at the superstructure of the universe and existence itself and ourselves, people examining that stuff, it was very international, it was very globalist, but not in a corporate, stinky way. It was in a very healthy, excellent way. So these colleges were interlinked, so they would say, look, there's a certain gravity and a certain sacredness in Ireland and in Brittany and Gaul and all these different locations, and of course in England. But there's also special gravitations elsewhere. So if you need to do this, you need to go to Egypt. If you need to do that, you need to go to Greece, And it was a huge undertaking, of course, travel in those days. Not quite what the history books would tell us. There were other things going on, which is a whole other conversation. But any sort of traveling and distance, meant a lot. It was quite an undertaking. It wasn't like hopping on a plane quite. And so it became, very much a sort of pilgrimage to be able to do that kind of thing. The beauty of today is that a lot of that knowledge is still here. You have to look for it, and you have to interpret it, and you have to filter it. It's not necessarily on the bookshelves. It's not necessarily like PDFs that you can download. It doesn't work like that. But that knowledge is here. But one has to achieve a certain initiation of oneself in the way you think before it becomes available to you. So in that way, the knowledge protects itself and keeps itself out of the hands of those who are basically unprepared for it, like that old kind of Tom and Jerry cartoon. If you get the magic spells and you're undeveloped or immature, you could wreak havoc in your own life. So there has to be a certain mental and psychological maturity before one is fit to know the secrets of how this place works. And that's what the unfoldment is about, is to say, here's a system of mental hygiene, and here is a system of psychological centeredness, which will put you in a very, very strong position to engage with, in quotes, the mystery. And I think it's a very real book. It's very contemporary as well, and we talk about a lot of wisdom. All wisdom is old, essentially. If you get that in your head, we can stop worrying about reinventing things. All wisdom is always old. But the way you communicate it and interpret it, and the way you reference it to modern culture, that's the artistry, that's the uniqueness that we all try and do in our workings. And hopefully, I've achieved something useful in my book, The Unfoldment.
The interesting thing here to me is that there may be in the next 20 years or so major change in the way this knowledge was is handled. As you say, for probably as far back as recorded history goes, there may have been mystery schools that imparted this knowledge through vigorous study and people having to attain different degrees of initiation in order to move on. But do you think that we may be entering a time when the imparting of this knowledge is going to change significantly?
I think that depends very much on people's will, which is a very misunderstood and misinterpreted thing these days. And it also depends very much on people's ability to take themselves seriously enough. Because if you just treat life as a place where you get nice things and have a nice time to the best of your abilities, then you're not in a place to go anywhere. You're not in a place to understand anything because you're not taking yourself seriously enough. So one of the principles in the unfoldment is to make real contact with real amazing knowledge and information and live and breathe that in your life. To some degree, you have to get over yourself. You have to transcend yourself. And to transcend self, you first need to attain total selfhood, which might sound paradoxical, but it's basically saying you have to understand every dark corner, every facet, every angle of your own mind and being before you can put that to one side and say, right, now I can lay that down for a moment, stop thinking, and just go directly into the world as a spiritual being. That process is very misunderstood in the mainstream. There are many excellent conversations about it in the alternative communities out there, but in the mainstream, you're not going to read about that. You're not going to see that discussed anywhere in any serious depth. You might read some popular self-help books on it, but it's not really going to give you what you want. So part of the answer to the question is one needs to get over oneself before you can really start to exchange that knowledge. So egos have to, be understood for what they are, which is just a little survival impulse to keep us alive and breathing and not drowning and not burning to death or whatever. And we also need to understand that the marketplace mentality, which is very unhealthy in much of the sort of industrial world, has to be put away. So the idea of what's in it for me, you have to put that to one side a little bit. You can't think in those terms like what's the reward for doing such and such. The main principle underlying the whole thing, the unfoldment itself, is the game here is one of growth. That is it. Everything else is secondary. Everything else that we do takes second place to that. So growth, emotional, intellectual, spiritual growth becomes the driving factor. When you do that, you automatically calibrate yourself with the growth of the universe. And in fact, you merge with it. And then a lot of very wonderful things begin to happen, which we've discussed some of those. But that process has to be compelled from within. You can't ask someone to do it for you. You can't read it in a sacred book somewhere. You can't go and have it ministered to you. You have to do it for yourself, and that means responsibility, which a lot of people, even the grown-ups, don't really want to do that. They don't really want that. They want to just be a bit happier, but they don't want to transform because that means change. So one of my persuasions, if you like, in the book is to say, you know what, change is pretty good actually. And once you get the hang of it, and once you get to surf the crest of it rather than being washed up in it, it's actually quite pleasurable. And so that's another thing that flies in opposition to the mainstream view, which is secretly we're taught to keep change at bay, and that stability and tradition are very, very important.
Yeah, the idea that we're going through life, keeping everything steady, staying in that reality tunnel, because that's really what it is, and not causing any problems. And your book is very good at talking about you've been talking about the individual, but you also spend some time in the book talking about what is around us. If you really open your eyes to what's going on in the world, and you give some fairly good history about the false flag operations and just patterns that tend to repeat themselves. I think once you wake up, in terms of increasing your level of consciousness, you do begin to see things for what they really are, rather because you can. I think what happens with me is when I hear something, I have an inner knowing that that's either true or not true. And then when you start putting all the pieces together, or the pieces of the puzzle, then you see how many of the constructs that we're asked to believe simply are not true. They're somebody else's reality being imposed on us.
Yeah, that's
politics,
really
mainstream media,
point.
whatever.
Yeah, yeah, and that sense of truth that you're talking about is definitely something that not only enhances but really sort of multiplies over and over when you engage with this process of awareness that I put forth in the book. And you realize that there is something there, we say, divine about this, in that there is this truth, there is this kind of absoluteness and this objectivity, but there's also relativity and there's also subjectivity. So I address that directly in the book and say, well, truth is both local and non-local. It's both subjective, like, well, whatever, it's different for everyone, and also it's absolute. It's the same for everybody. And the only thing that differentiates the two is your level of awareness. The more aware you become, the more absolute truth becomes. The more dumb you are, then the more relative truth is. And that has proven itself over and over in my life. And with all the wisest people I know, we all kind of feel the same way. And I just tried to put that into words. And part of understanding truth is to resist the temptation to only engage with light and positivity, which is a very dire problem in the New Age movement. And a lot of popular New Age authors fall foul of that. And I understand why. But when I encounter someone who says, hey, I don't do negativity, I don't do that, I always say to them, well, in that case, you're missing out on half of the universe, because half the universe is necessarily negative, just as though the other half is positive. You absolutely need the two. And it's a very, very important lesson, because we tend to associate negative with bad and positive with good. The further you go into this, the further you go, as Nietzsche put it, beyond good and evil, you realize that that's not actually true. And so in my book, I have a very conscious balancing of light and shadow, positive and negative. And you need that to properly perceive existence. You need to really totally understand the map of polarity. You need to walk it. You need to go over that terrain yourself, again, before you can transcend it. So polarity is, again, a very important mechanism in the universe that says, through polarity, through negative and positive, through the peaks and the troughs, the ups and the downs, the good stuff and the weird stuff, we see energy transforming from one state to another. And the more closely you perceive that, the less necessity there is for extremes of that. So the hands-on experience of that is, when you perceive reality properly and you start to understand what polarity is, which is discussed at length in the book, it stops banging you on the nose anymore. You don't have those roller coaster days in quite the same way, where one day is wonderful and one day is awful. That ceases to happen in quite the same way, because once you make the effort to understand what polarity is, what positive and negative forces actually are at their root, they stop hassling you, shall we say, and you get to have more say in how those things unfold in your life. So there is a very immediate benefit in doing that, but that just happens anyway, because as I say, the process of awakening, the process of truth, is really an alignment. It's like saying, hey, here I am. And the universe goes, oh, hi, how you doing? Nice to see you. Now I can see you properly for the first time, and we can actually work together. So the more conscious you become, the more visible you are to the universe, the more visible you are to the divine. And then there's a relationship there. In some of the old mystical traditions, they would call this the conversation with the higher guardian angel. That's what it means. So it's coded into Christian terminology. Well, that's what they're talking about. They're saying that this force is very real, and it's a very magical, wonderful thing that lots of fiction deals with, but it has its basis in felt reality. So that's exciting.
Yeah, as I've I guess increased my level of awareness through different spiritual practices and other just delving into it, I guess. One thing I noticed is that when bad things happen, which would have been judged by, the majority of people being bad, I broke my arm and was off for 4 months. I got deathly ill, almost died of pneumonia. Different problems happened.